Good evening, and welcome to the second lecture in our public lecture series on the Wisconsin Idea, past and present. For students who are enrolled in the course for credit, there were some seats reserved up at the front. I see there's one still unclaimed here. So if you are a student enrolled for credit, there's a seat for you. If all the students are already seated, that's a spare seat that's available. This lecture series, as those of you who were here last week have heard, this lecture series is part of a new course that is being taught for the first time this fall under the auspices of the Department of Sociology here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. My name is Chad Allen Goldberg. I am a professor in the Sociology Department, and I have the honor to serve as the instructor for the course this semester. The Wisconsin Idea, as we talked about last week, has always been about more than training students for the workforce. It meant, as Adlai Stevenson once put it, a faith in the application of intelligence and reason to the problems of society, and the aspiration to light the way of Wisconsin's citizens and government with the best torches of knowledge and understanding that their university can provide. Accordingly, this lecture series and the course with which it is associated aim to bring students, staff, and faculty in the UW system into a broader conversation with the citizens of the state about how the knowledge produced at the University of Wisconsin has benefited the public in the past and continues to do so today. I encourage all of you to participate actively through our course website, www.wiscidea.com, and our Facebook page. If you happen to be live tweeting this or subsequent lectures, please use the hashtag #WiscIdea. I should add that the Sociology Department is offering this course on a shoestring budget out of our academic and supplies and expenses budget. If you would like to contribute to this project to allow us to offer real-time broadcasts or otherwise improve our offerings this semester or in the future, please consider making a contribution to the Department of Sociology Annual Fund. You can do so through our course website. We are fortunate to continue our lecture series tonight with a lecture by Dr. Curt Meine on conservation and the Wisconsin Idea, an evolving legacy. Dr. Meine is a conservation biologist, historian, and writer. He is currently director for conservation biology and history with the Center for Humans and Nature. He is senior fellow with the Aldo Leopold Foundation based in Baraboo, Wisconsin. Research associate with the International Crane Foundation, also located in Baraboo, and associate adjunct professor in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. During his conservation career over the last 20 years, Dr. Meine has worked on projects involving topics ranging from biodiversity, conservation planning, sustainable agriculture and international development, to crane and wetland conservation, prairie restoration, and development of community-based conservation programs. He has worked in Europe, Asia, and across North America in partnership with organizations including the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the World Conservation Union, the World Wildlife Fund, the American Museum of Natural History, and the Wisconsin Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Letters. He has served on the Board of Governors of the Society of Conservation Biology and on the editorial boards of the journals Conservation Biology and Environmental Ethics. Dr. Meine has edited and authored several books. He's the author of the award-winning Aldo Leopold, His Life and Work, which has been called the standard biography of Leopold, and the co-editor of The Essential Aldo Leopold, both published by the University of Wisconsin Press. You may have noticed as you came in, those books are on sale right outside, thanks to the University of Wisconsin Press. If you would like to purchase a copy, they will be here all evening, even after the Q&A period, so you don't have to rush. And I understand Dr. Meine has graciously offered to sign copies if anybody would like to have their copy of either of these books or both of these books signed tonight. More recently, Dr. Meine has edited a volume of Leopold's work entitled A Sand County Almanac and Other Writings on Ecology and Conservation. I should say that like all of our speakers, he is graciously donating his time and expertise tonight, free of charge, out of his commitment to public service. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Curt Meine.
Really my honor to be here, and thank you. I can't imagine a more important place to be at a more important time or a more important topic for me personally to explore with you all. So a couple thanks first to Chad and Patrick for all they're doing to organize this course. Extraordinary, needed, and I'm hoping to make it to as many of the Tuesday night lectures myself as I can. Thanks to James Hovler, who's kicked us off last week. It was sort of like the first leg of a long relay race for the next 15 weeks. And so I'm picking up the baton, and you'll see some direct connections to what he shared with us last week. Thanks to all of you for being here. Some of you are enrolled in the class, and this is your obligation to be here. And I know most of you, however, are here because you want to be, because you care about the things that are being discussed. And I suppose there's some people in that overflow room. If you're there, thank you for being there and also being with us. Okay, let's see. Oh, and your advertisement is up there, if you want to. Okay, so there's some upcoming events you might want to catch. Chad can tell you more about these afterwards, but we plugged these slides in at the last minute to share some upcoming events that are on their way. All right. Conservation and the Wisconsin idea and evolving legacy. Before I get going on this, I added this at the last minute myself. I want to dedicate this talk to one of my own mentors who passed away just last month. Dr. Alan Bogue in the history department was my advisor back when I was in graduate school. I hadn't seen him in many years, but I did see the notice of his passing just last month, and it reminded me in a very powerful way of how much we're indebted to all those who mentor us, especially in this institution. So in honor of Dr. Bogue, who was, prior to Bill Cronin, the Frederick Jackson Turner Professor in the history department, let's honor and remember all of our friends and mentors across the entire UW system who've devoted themselves to public service, living, working, and teaching in the spirit of the Wisconsin idea. So I thank Alan for all that he did to help prepare me for the things that I'm going to share with you tonight. So here's my plan. In the next 40 minutes or so, I hope it'll be 40 minutes. This is the first time through for a lecture, and you never quite know how it's going to work out, but here's the plan anyway. Take a bit of time to set the stage for the topic. A little quick, wild ride through the Wisconsin landscape historically, and talking about conservation in the landscape. Conservation before the conservation movement per se. Some overlap in this with last week's lecture, but from a little different angle. This core moment of the crystallizing of the Wisconsin idea during the early progressive movement. We'll take some time there. A totally inadequate review of a century of UW commitment to conservation, so a sampling of some key events and individuals. And then some last thoughts and prospects for the path ahead. Setting the stage, by the way, for my colleague Paul Robbins, who will be here later in the semester. So that's what I'm going to try to get at. Some caveats before I do that. Last week, Chad described this whole course as a trial run, and indeed, tonight I'm on a trial run with this lecture. There are not a lot of readings to choose from. I asked Chad to share with you Bill Cronin's wonderful essay, Landscape and Home, that some of you may have been familiar with, but maybe a lot of you not. And so there's a challenge for us right away. There's not a lot of recent readings on this theme, and so those students sitting in these reserved seats, there's an opportunity waiting for students to take on the task of writing and researching this evolving story of conservation and how it relates to the Wisconsin idea. It's a large and sweeping topic. I can't pretend in one short lecture to cover it. In fact, I kind of freaked out, frankly, over the weekend as I got into it and realized that this is about 5 lectures crammed into one. So bear with me and we'll see how we come out the other side of it. But I do want to say that this is just a sampling. And finally, I was a late addition to the lineup here. It was just a few weeks ago, and then the schedule got altered that I'm the second week. So I didn't have a whole lot of time to prepare. That said, I'm very glad I ended up on week 2. Because at the core of my presentation is a fundamental point and proposal. That we can't fully appreciate the history, value, and current need for the Wisconsin idea apart from Wisconsin's landscape and our relationship to it. So with that in mind, here are a couple images to set the stage. And the first image is this one itself, a satellite image, just for perspective. A moment to look at Wisconsin from a different angle, to see it as a landscape, one with people in it, but people in community with soils, water, plants, and animals. The Wisconsin idea is grounded in this place and in its natural and cultural history. And throughout its history, the Wisconsin idea has evolved with and within this landscape, always exploring what our relationships and responsibilities within that larger community entail. So with that in mind, here's a second image that I want to use as just setting the stage. This has long been one of my favorite photographs of Aldo Leopold, long before this opportunity arose. I could give an entire lecture about this photo. But in preparing for the evening tonight, I saw it in a different light. I've used it many, many, many times. Because I also realized this is the first image that came to my mind when I said, if I were to use a slide, a picture, an image of the Wisconsin idea, this would be it. This is the image that came into my mind. Here's the condensed version of the story. It's 1938. It's a hot day. You can tell by Aldo's sleeves being rolled up. And the young guy on the left without a shirt on. It's a hot day in the midst of the Dust Bowl years. This is outside of Madison in the crossroads of Riley, where the tavern is that I know some of you have frequented. This is Aldo Leopold meeting and talking with a farmer named Reuben Paulson, Reuben's 2 sons, and in the middle there is one of Aldo Leopold's graduate students, a fellow named Lyle Souls. They're meeting out on these farms, a place called Riley, again. Leopold is a few years into his university career. He's breaking new ground in the new field of wildlife management, research, and practice. Dominant theme in his early years as a faculty member here was encouraging wildlife on the farm, involving farmers, other landowners, hunters, students, really anyone he could reach in the process. And in fact, he'd worked with the farmers in this neighborhood, connecting them with hunters from town to create a new cooperative where the hunters and the farmers would work together. So why did that image stand out? Because I like this notion of a professor who just happened to be one of the world's leading experts in wildlife management and a neighbor, farmer, and landowner having access to and working with one another. And I like that it was a two-way street, actually a multi-directional conversation, really. Somewhere in this photo is the story, in that story is the essence for me of the Wisconsin idea as it applied to conservation. Again, experts from the university meeting and talking, sharing information both ways. My colleague, retired from the university here, Pete Nowak, has made a point in a recent article. Conservation isn't a practice or a program or a plan. Conservation is a journey. It's a journey we take as individuals and as a society, and that journey has always been about changing relationships. Leopold took this same idea and stated it in a slightly different way. This was Leopold's line. Conservation viewed in its entirety is the slow, laborious unfolding of a new relationship between people and land. The story of that journey is a complex one. So I'm going to introduce it in a very basic way here for the next couple minutes through a little graphic I use sometimes with my own students. So this is like the academic part of this talk. So if you were asking about the history of conservation and asking if there's a book you could read on the whole history of conservation, I'd have to say no. Why? Because it's a huge and complex topic. And this is a way of illustrating this. I can give you books on the history of conservation science, or the many sciences that contribute to conservation. But conservation is not just about science. It's also about what we do in practice, out there on the landscape every day. All the tools and techniques we develop. And these interact. Of course, science helps create your techniques and technologies. And those suggest new research questions. And those all interact with your policies, how we govern ourselves. There's many books written on how we have chosen to govern ourselves through our conservation policies. And finally, there are the ideas, the philosophies that guide us in our conservation practices, in the research questions, and in our policies. It's a dense, interactive system, and that's the point here, right? That if you want to understand how conservation unfolds, that slow, laborious unfolding, there's no one place to start. It might be a question that intrigues you as a scientist, that suggests a new practice, that recommends a new policy, that raises new philosophical questions, that in turn influences new practices or new research, and around and around and around it goes, right? And beyond that is that whole social, cultural context, and even beyond that, reality. The natural world, the socio-natural world that we inhabit. So that complex story, what I call the big Venn diagram of conservation history here, helps us understand how the Wisconsin idea fits in. Because really it focuses, doesn't it, on that science policy connection. Whoops, I hate when that happens. Now what did I do? There we go. Bear with me. We'll get back to it. Here we go. Advance. Here we go. And to review. There we go. Okay. Take your breath. All right. I promise not to press that button again. I was looking for the pointer. Okay. That science policy connection is at the heart of the Wisconsin idea. When we add in the ethics and practice part, that helps explain Wisconsin's unique historical role and contribution. Until recently, Wisconsin has played a leading role in the story, the journey of conservation, with an influence that stretched well beyond this campus, this university system, and the state's boundaries. In fact, Wisconsin's leadership in conservation has been, until recently, global in scope. Now, over the last few years, I've done another lecture related to this on the history of conservation in Wisconsin. In fact, I'll be doing it next week at the UW Fond du Lac, if you have any friends up there. And that's a whole lecture on the history of conservation beyond the university. But I'm going to give you the last few slides of that because I want to get to the point of framing the university. And at the end of that lecture, we ask what characterizes Wisconsin's conservation and environmental legacy. And I won't go into detail on any of this, but to run through them. This combination of all those pieces of conservation. We have varied approaches. We protect places. We restore places. We hopefully sustainably manage and steward places. It happens all over on public lands and private lands and tribal lands. Across the landscape, from our urban areas to our most wild places and everything in between. We have a tradition of this community-based approach. But here's the key one, the focus on this critical role and combination of education and policy. The University of the Wisconsin idea. And in this, I really do owe a debt to our colleague and friend Bill Cronin, whose, again, essay I recommended for a reading tonight. Because Bill helped answer this question, what accounts for this unique role in history that we've had? Is there something in the water? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and I'm adding to Bill's list here a little bit, but it's that we can read our natural and cultural history on the land. Our native nations have played a key role in environmental stewardship over the decades and generations. Wisconsin grew up and with the conservation movement. It's still a largely rural state, and so our connections to the land are relatively strong. It's a working landscape, but wildness is still woven in and through it. We're a tourism magnet, of course. We have this long tradition of hunting and outdoor recreation. We have had bipartisan political commitment historically to conservation. And lastly, the University of Wisconsin and its role. So, to quote Bill Cronin's words, the Wisconsin idea has encouraged scholars with an interest in land to share their knowledge with the people of the state, and this has had as much effect on the professors as on the citizenry. That two-way street. So the UW has played an essential role in Wisconsin's conservation history, and the Wisconsin idea is at the heart of that history. So that whole essay, that whole other lecture goes into history, but I'm really just taking out the part that focuses on the UW. All right, let's move to the next phase here. Conservation in the Wisconsin landscape. Everybody take a deep breath. Of course, we're going on a wild ride. We're going to do 15,000 years of environmental history in about 7 or 8 minutes. Ready? With me? Okay. We'll start here with the glaciers for a real reason. And it's a little hard to see, I know, in this room, but I'll show you. And there's Wisconsin right at the base of the ice sheet of the last glaciation. The Late Wisconsin Glacier Complex. I'm going to tell you who named that later on if you don't know. Geology is going to run through this lecture. We're going to talk geology a little bit. We grow up with this landscape, or if you come to Wisconsin, you soon learn about our glaciated landscape. You learn about the landscape features that it left us with, the Ice Age deposits. And by the way, most of these maps you will see have been prepared by University of Wisconsin system scholars. Every time you see something, you're appreciating the role of the university. So we have the Ice Age Trail, for example, out near where I live. The landscapes of Wisconsin are diverse. They provided different opportunities and constraints. They left us with soils, some of them some of the richest in the Midwest, some of them not so rich, but that has evoked different needs over the generations. Our waters are gifts of the glaciers, and we sit astride these two great watersheds of the continent, the Great Lakes and the Mississippi. And those waters endowed us with this wealth of water, our rivers, lakes, and wetlands. And the vegetation that came in the next few thousand years, it varied, but here's what we were left with at the time of European arrival, the pre-settlement vegetation with our north woods and our southern prairies and savannas and that tension zone, as we call it, between them. I know we have sociologists in the room, so I am going to include some pictures of plants and animals. The diversity of our flora and fauna. I was not going to use this data slide, but I thought I would. Why? Because it's another example. All these numbers that we care about in the conservation world, guess what? Almost every one of these numbers is compiled by a University of Wisconsin system biologist at some point. Even in my references there, these are colleagues when I asked these numbers. The diversity that we were given of plants and animals. Yes, that's the badger right in the middle, of course. But I kept these numbers in because it themselves are testaments to the Wisconsin idea. We lost things along the way, species that were extirpated or driven extinct. Here are a few of them that we have lost in the last century and a half. But extinction began a long time ago. The first wave of extinction is the loss of those great Pleistocene megafauna, the saber-tooth and the giant short-faced bear and the giant beaver and many other things, reminding us that humans have had an impact on this landscape for a long, long time. In fact, some of the earliest indications of human impacts dating back to right after the glaciers melted back. One example of this from down in Racine, this mammoth now on display in Milwaukee. So the human role in the landscape is long and deep, and it has left its impact. The layers of native history. This is just one slide covering 10,000 years, of course, but it reminds us that we are latecomers to this landscape, and the signs of the presence of our native peoples are everywhere. When you drive to Milwaukee, you pass Aztalan, the city on the outskirts of the Cahokia complex 1,000 years ago. And you may have wondered, why is this place Aztalan in the middle of Wisconsin? Well, it wasn't Wisconsin back then. You don't have to go far from where we're sitting to see the effigy mounds that mark the landscape. In fact, we are a global center for this unique cultural feature. There's one from right up there on Observatory Hill that you have walked by many, many times. Come the Europeans, the arrival of Nicolet in 1634, altering the history as the Ho-Chunk people met him on the shores of Green Bay and began the process of utter transformation of the cultures and landscapes. Here is the map of the native tribal territories at the time they were designated on maps in 1825, and the treaties that removed the native people from the landscape. But we do have the presence of our native neighbors across Wisconsin still, and I'll come back to this shortly. The early economy, as Europeans came in, first furs and then the lead mining boom of the 1820s and 30s began the transformation of our landscape. And that landscape was really transformed by this rather obscure, peculiar little thing. You see my little star down there. It's right down there on the Illinois border. There it is at the base of that fence post. That is the point of beginning for the land surveys that would measure Wisconsin. From that point all the way up north to Lake Superior, the line goes straight north. The land division that happened with the Public Land Survey and the surveyors going out over a 40-year period and subdividing the land, giving us this pattern that we are familiar with, especially in the American Midwest, thus facilitating the commodification of the land and all of its, quote, resources, whether it's the drainage of wetlands, exploitation of wildlife, the conversion of the prairies to agriculture happening in a rapid wave, and most dramatically, of course, the deforestation of the North Country, especially the great white pine of the North. In a matter of just 30 years, the northern pine forests being brought down and transported to the mills along the rivers. This is the Chippewa River. Peak pine. Didn't take long, from 1870 to 1910 or so, to deplete the pine. Think of that curve as you think about the Wisconsin idea. It may seem a stretch, but there's a correlation there, and we'll talk about that. And the conversion of that pine into the farming landscape that we all know. That is the rapid ride through conservation's landscape. So we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. Catch your breath. My point in doing that quick ride is to say that there's a unique set of environmental, historical, economic, and cultural circumstances that prepared the way for the emergence of a robust conservation and movement in Wisconsin that would have national implications. So how about conservation before the movement itself? Well, we can go back and think about our native neighbors again. So I want to make a first point that modern conservation has precedence, in fact, in varied cultural traditions and histories, including diverse Native American and Wisconsin tribal traditions. It's a large and nuanced topic, obviously. I can't really cover it in great detail, but I did want to make this point, that figures such as these, some you know the names of Black Hawk. You may not know Yellow Thunder or Chief Buffalo of the Ojibwe and Ho-Chunk and Sauk nations. Different tribal communities, but they had a shared history, these three individuals in their communities, of resistance to removal. When we want to think about the origins of a commitment to the landscape, these are the three we can look to, among many others, of course. Those who refused to leave, even after they were removed, came back time and time again. Patty Lowe, our colleague, has written several books that I highly recommend if you would like to learn more about the native place in the landscape, the inheritors of present-day native communities who have held high the conservation ethic that we will come to associate later on with Aldo Leopold and others. And we see it on the ground, of course, literally see it on the ground or from space in places like the Menominee Forest. renowned around the world as one of the great case studies of sustainable forest management. That's the line between the Menominee Forest and their neighbors, literally visible from space. So now we're getting into something we recognize. 1848, Wisconsin's admitted to the Union. The university is founded the next year. And one of the points that people studying the history of the Wisconsin idea make is that the state and the university developed simultaneously, that they grew up together in a sense. But when you look at the charter of the University of Wisconsin, as one commentator said, there's no hint of the Wisconsin idea in that charter. It would emerge in the following generation. Well, let me go back to that. Oh yeah, I got the 48ers down here on the right. The 48ers, the immigrants to the U.S. in the wake of the failed revolutions in Europe in 1848. Many Germans, of course, but also Czechs, Hungarians, other Europeans. Many were carriers of that same strain of German idealism that Professor Hovler talked about last week. And so there's some, at least a thought that this influence was important as a foundation for the Wisconsin idea. There's some interesting argument back and forth on how much you can credit this Central European influence. Fascinating as I've learned about it even in the last few days. But there was among this immigrant population, especially the German and European 48ers, a high regard for science and public education, also highly reform-minded. Many of them were leading abolitionists at the time in the run-up to the Civil War. And the Civil War is a moment as well. In the midst of the war, Abraham Lincoln signs the Morrill Act. These are some things that came up in discussion last week. That act that officially donated to the states the land grants that would provide for the emerging colleges for the benefit of agriculture and the mechanic arts. Lincoln signed it 2 months after the Homestead Act. And just the day after, signing a bill that would create the Transcontinental Railroad. It was another way of encouraging sound development in the West. Most states created new universities separate from and devoted to those devoted to the liberal arts. The Wisconsin legislature made a different choice. It decided that the existing, by that time, UW would receive the land grant. That is how this became the land-grant college. And again, Bill Cronin makes the point in his essay, it's this combination of liberal arts and agricultural college on a single great research institution. It's not as common as one might think, and has promoted a cross-fertilization of the pure and applied sciences, especially environmental sciences. So we end up with a single university. In these early days, on the frontier of settlement, a number of key conservation figures passed through the Wisconsin landscape. Some of these names you'll know, some of them not. Carl Schurz went on to become Secretary of Interior, was from Watertown. Or John Wesley Powell, famous for going the first guy to go down the Colorado River with his team. He grew up near Delavan. Both would become national figures in conservation and in connecting science and policy through institutions and the agencies of government beyond their Wisconsin years. But probably the best known of the transient Wisconsinites grew up here on this little lake near Portage. That, of course, was John Muir. John Muir arrives here as a young man. He grows up in Portage, makes his name by coming to the state fair at Camp Randall and showing off those cool, wonderful, strange inventions that he made, and already became famous. Then he joins the university as a student and reflects on his own experience for the first time as he comes to Madison. But his lovely book, My Boyhood and Youth, if you've not read it, very evocative, of course, of frontier Wisconsin. But that's where he was a student, North Hall, the dorm at the time. So, John Muir, before I go on, John Muir, known for his activism, of course, later on. It's 100th anniversary of the Park Service right now. But I just want to add a little teaser note. He was also very interested in geology. Another person very interested in geology was this guy, Increase Lapham. Now you're going to meet all these characters. You met Bascom at great length last week. I can't obviously do justice. All of these you could do a whole lecture on, but Increase Lapham, Wisconsin's first scientist, the first scholar and the first author, published the first book in Wisconsin. Interested in all fields of natural science, but also in archaeology, the human dimensions. Publisher, as you'll see at the bottom I listed here, The Destruction of Forest Trees, now going on so rapidly in the state of Wisconsin, the first signature document on Wisconsin's forests. Now, in almost every case, these individuals that I'm going to mention represent also enduring institutions. In Lapham's case, he helped create, to name just a few of them, the National Weather Service, the State Geological and Natural History Survey, Wisconsin Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Letters, the Historical Society, the Milwaukee Public School System, the University of Wisconsin. Increase Lapham would remain active through the 1870s and so overlaps with this guy who you met last week, John Bascom. So I'm not going to cover him because he was well covered last week, but let me emphasize a theme that came up in the discussion after the lecture last week. That is the development of the agricultural programs at the UW. A lot happened under Bascom's tenure. So the department was established. Later on, first dean hired to develop. The experiment stations were established, first farmer short courses, and finally the College of Agriculture itself established in 1889. It's a complicated history. It was not always a happy family on campus. There were real tensions between these missions of the liberal arts and applied science. Bascom, in one of the things I was reading, said he was uninterested in early extension work. But what's interesting is that those tensions between applied and pure, between the liberal arts and sciences, drove really important developments, these developments in agriculture and extension. And this interface of agriculture and conservation would become a real key, important theme distinguishing Wisconsin. That gets played out through people like this. The role of the dairy industry, a major force behind the Wisconsin idea in many of these developments. Hiram Smith, pictured there on the left, one of the founders of the Wisconsin Dairymen's Association. It was said of Smith that he was the most severe critic the farmers of Wisconsin ever had, and their best friend. Because it was Smith, along with William Hord and a few others, who led the great transition from unsustainable wheat farming to dairy. Smith was a regent at the university, overlapping with Bascom, and helped start the dairy school here in the state experimental station. He hired Henry as the dean. He was a key figure, and this is important because up until that time, agriculture was depleting the soils of Wisconsin, to simplify it. Henry, I don't have a picture of him. He's really hard to find online, but you can at least see this testimony to his work. He himself wrote in 1902 now, "When I came to Madison 22 years ago, the Ag Department received about 1 letter per week on average. Now our correspondence amounts to thousands of letters annually, farmers writing to us on every conceivable topic. The department, grown into a college and experiment station, has become a bureau of information." There are a lot of other figures. You can't talk about them all, but here's another one. F.H. King, as he is best known, who also became one of the leaders in this transition, the great transition that included dairy. And also now looked back on as a real key thinker in early ideas about sustainable agriculture. After he went on a trip to China, he was primarily a soil scientist. That was his key field. He was fascinated by how the Chinese system of agriculture could sustain itself for thousands of years. And so this book has become one of the early texts in what we now think of as sustainable agriculture. And then my favorite, T.C. Chamberlain. You know these names because you pass them on campus, right? Chamberlain. Did I mention that he was a geologist? He was many things, but he was primarily associated with his efforts to figure out how the Wisconsin landscape became what it was. He was a glaciologist. He is the guy who named the Wisconsin Ice Age. He did many things in his scientific career, including some of the very most classic, important early studies on climate and the role of carbon in the atmosphere and in the earth. So when we look at the history of climate science, Chamberlain is one of those top 4 or 5 early scientists working out these understandings in the late 1800s. He had strong support as Bascom's inheritor of the presidency at the university. Strong support for the Wisconsin idea and for the agricultural part of it and extension, although it's not quite called that yet. He understood scholarship as something that served the public. He wrote, "Scholarship for the sake of the scholar is simply refined selfishness. Scholarship for the sake of the state and the people is refined patriotism." His work is fun to look at now, I'll tell you. You really begin to appreciate what these amazing generations of field scientists did. Here's the kettle moraine that he first depicted. He was born down there, raised down by Beloit. He grew up in this glaciated landscape. It intrigued him. But he represents all those who for generations to come would make Wisconsin a global leader in geology and all the earth scientists. So here's a few of his papers. I can give you these references if you want to know them. I know you can't read them very well now, but again, these three, I chose just these three to mention. His important role in early climate science. It's not something we devised in the last 15 years. And Chamberlain is the proof of that. And you can see his plaque up there on Observatory Hill. And if you can't read it here, but now you can see what he says. As president, he made the spirit of research effective in the life of the university. He's a leader in science, but commemorates his, quote, services to Wisconsin. So that sets the stage for this moment in the early 20th century when these themes come together. And again, this was introduced last week. I'll try to fill in a few more details. It's a dense period. I can only skim through a few of the key points. But let's begin with Frederick Jackson Turner. UW grad in 1884, taught here for 20 years, 1890 to 1910, fundamentally changing the way Americans understand their history and development through his famous essay, Significance of the Frontier in American History. His great contribution, emphasizing the geographic dimension of historical development, helping us understand that American institutions, even the American character, were formed in this connection to our landscapes, that our political and economic institutions were also expressions of our interaction with our geography. That famous essay is still being read, of course, because it defined, as it was being called at the time, the closing of the frontier. In Wisconsin, one of the expressions of that was the deforestation of the North. This fellow, Philibert Roth, was hired to come to Wisconsin after the legislature passed an act appointing a state forestry commission in 1897. For the next 2 generations, this was a critical problem in public policy. What to do with the cut-over North Woods? Roth sort of begins that process by describing the conditions. He did the first lectures in forestry at the university. And as with that shift from wheat farming to dairy, this was at the heart of our economic development. How do we deal with this now overexploited, devastated landscape? Or in Turner's terms, perhaps, how is the post-frontier economy going to be put on a more sustainable basis? So I think I'll skip over this quotation right now, but that's the point it's making, that we have suffered from this rapid exploitation of the forest, and it's to the detriment of the Commonwealth, is really the point that Roth was making. But it was, in fact, through the rise of Robert La Follette, in part in response to the power of the lumber barons, that we began to think about the public policy dimensions of this. We don't normally think of Fightin' Bob, and there's his, by the way, his home farm down in Primrose Township, not so far from where we are. Went out there one day. Fighting Bob and his wife, Belle, who you met last week, the first woman to graduate from the UW Law School. We don't usually think of the La Follettes first and foremost as conservation figures, but it was an inherent part of their progressive campaign. Now, this is where I take a short detour into geology. We've met some really interesting people fascinated by geology. We've got John Wesley Powell, we got John Muir figuring out glaciers, we've got Increase Lapham, we've got T.C. Chamberlain. Last week, we met Florence Bascom. This was the best fact I learned last week. Florence Bascom, the first woman to get a PhD in geology, daughter of John Bascom. I love that. Made me pay attention to this thing that came across last week. This was posted last week. Thank you to the Geological Natural History Survey for sharing this. This was in Wired magazine. Dear college students, you should take geology. This was from that article. If the goal of college is to create an informed citizenry that can then navigate their lives, a background in geology, even if it might be a single class, might be one of the most important disciplines you could choose. Geology wasn't just a thing of the 1800s. It remains a powerfully interesting discipline for seeing the big picture. That perhaps accounts for this strange, disproportionate leadership that geologists gave to this state and to this university through the 1800s and into the 1900s. And that brings us to the next important geologist in the journey of the Wisconsin idea, and that's Charles Van Hise. Perfect lead-in from last week. His close relationship with Fightin' Bob La Follette. Van Hise also, as he became more important in administration and president of the university here, became also deeply concerned about the forestry questions in the state. This is from Gwen Drury's wonderful overview of the Wisconsin idea that's online. If we can get the reference for you. Van Hise's study of the geology and natural resources of Wisconsin, combined with Turner's study of the way in which people had interacted with those resources and with each other, as non-native settlement advanced across the continent, combined with La Follette's interest in the law and politics, gave them a uniquely broad shared vision. Van Hise, Turner, La Follette. And we have to add yet another common point of context here, and that's Theodore Roosevelt. This is the photo from the epic 1908 White House Governor's Conference on the Conservation of Natural Resources. A high water mark in the early conservation movement in the progressive era. Every governor of the state attended, as well as 300 other people. And this was the moment, in a sense, when conservation, even that word, became embedded in American public life. In addition to the Wisconsin's official delegation, the governor at the time, attending and speaking, we also had T.C. Chamberlain. As president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Van Hise was there because he was president of the National Association of State Universities. Out of that, in fact, came Van Hise's book, The Conservation of Natural Resources in the United States, the first textbook in conservation, written while he was president of the university. And I'll just read a little bit of this quote. It seems to me from the point of the not distant future of the human race, the great movement for conservation is more important than all other movements now before the people. The principles of conservation require for their practice a sense of social responsibility. So Van Hise is now one of the leading scholars in addition to all his other roles in conservation. And hot on the heels of Van Hise's text was Charles McCarthy's book, The Wisconsin Idea. The Wisconsin Idea as a book. McCarthy was a student of Frederick Jackson Turner's. And guess who he got to write the introduction? Theodore Roosevelt. Thanks to the movement for genuinely democratic popular government, which Senator LaFollette led to overwhelming victory in Wisconsin, that state has become literally a laboratory for wise experimental legislation aiming to secure the social and political betterment of the people as a whole. And in another article written about this time, after TR's out of office as president, he wrote, "In no other state in the Union has any university done the same work for the community that has been done in Wisconsin by the University of Wisconsin." So here's Teddy Roosevelt endorsing the Wisconsin idea. This is 1918, Theodore Roosevelt and Van Hise. Late in the lives. In fact, both of these gentlemen would be dead within a year. It was kind of, I saw this photo and I added because it's sort of the symbolic end of an era, the closing of that period of experimental progressive legislation. But conservation hardly was done evolving. In fact, it had just begun. But during this golden moment of Wisconsin progressivism, conservation became part of the university's portfolio, and a key aspect of state policy due to the vision and leadership of all these individuals. But it was still only beginning to be woven into the fabric of Wisconsin life. And in fact, that was one of the flaws, perhaps unavoidable, of progressive era conservation. It relied on top-down policies developed by experts. Another shortcoming was it tended to measure its success according to a very simple calculus of economic efficiency and value, not by a broader set of social and ecological goals. And in both cases, this top-down approach and this focus on economic measures, the Wisconsin idea would, in the next century, in fact, help to redirect and even redefine conservation. So, pause for a sip. It's hard to even know where to begin to talk about the subsequent century. So I'm going to give you a sampling, a few themes that we can begin to probe this rich history. It starts with UW Extension. This is Bob LaFollette in his first address to the legislature as governor. The state will not have discharged its duty to the university, nor the university fulfilled its mission to the people, until adequate means have been furnished to every young man and woman in the state to acquire an education at home in every department of learning. This is the expansion. The university is engaged not just in teaching and research, but extension, public service, and outreach. Van Hise was a little skeptical of this, but he was won over by 1905. The Division of University Extension was established in 1906. Charles McCarthy was a strong advocate. The very first county agent, this is him, was hired in 1912. In fact, it was a major issue in the 1912 election, a very important election. And shortly thereafter, in 1914, the Smith-Lever Act was passed in Congress. This is the act that provided federal funding for the state, county, federal partnerships of cooperative extension programs. This is when there had been precedents to this, but extension is now firmly embedded, and it goes on the air. I have to include WHA radio, right? 1917, right in the aftermath of that. The first radio broadcasts on the oldest continuous radio station, our own WHA. So extension is now a full expression of the Wisconsin idea. There's no easy transition to this next topic, but water. Wisconsin has always been a national and global leader in the study of fresh water. To this day it is, and partly that's attributable to the UW Center for Limnology. The two great early figures, Edward Burge and Chauncey Juday, establishing Wisconsin here on the shores of what has been called the most studied lake in the world, Lake Mendota. Founding of the Trout Lake Station up north. This carries on through generations up to the present, through people like Art Hassler, who was a globally renowned limnologist himself. Burge, going back to him, was a leading figure in this. In fact, of course, served stints as UW's president. Water has always been one of our great assets, obviously, naturally, but water science has also been one of our great attributes. Forestry and land use. This is what we were left with in the 1890s and 1900s. And it became a leading issue, of course, for this next generation. The university by this time was establishing itself, let me just stay there, as a center for economics under people like Richard Ely. I'm just going to name the names. I can't go into too great deal. John R. Commons, key figure deserving of a full lecture in himself. Wisconsin becomes home to the study of institutional economics with its emphasis on collective action through institutions rather than following abstract economic laws. Institutional economics has been called economics in action. And it also required interdisciplinary inquiry. If you're going to solve the economic problems of the cutover forests, you're going to have to know something about forestry and geography and all the other factors that impinge on this. This leads to the founding also of the Department of Agricultural Economics on the other side of campus, with key figures like Henry Taylor and Benjamin Hibbard, names extraordinarily important and influential in that field. And that was also where George Wehrwein came in. He was more than any perhaps one individual, although it was a large group of people working on this, figured out what we were going to do with the North Woods through his innovative policies and helping the cutover North Woods recover. So, I added a quote here, conservation involves a deliberate use of restraint in the present in order to leave a supply for future generations. A pretty strong economic argument there. But it was Wehrwein, along with a generation of agricultural economics, who helped us to get the North Country on a more sustainable basis again. And it was in that very Department of Agricultural Economics, in fact, that Aldo Leopold lands. Aldo Leopold hired to be an expert in wildlife management, but guess what? There's no Department of Wildlife Management anywhere because he hasn't yet invented the field. So he's put into the Department of Agricultural Economics. It was one of the most consequential appointments in the history of conservation and in the history of the University of Wisconsin. Leopold was only here for 15 years on campus, but he was a transformative figure. Can't give his full story, so here are just a few illustrative episodes and aspects of his work, looking at the three legs of Wisconsin idea, teaching. Leopold was teaching a brand new field. He actually wrote the first text in the field up there, game management. Teaching short courses, undergraduates, and the first graduate students in wildlife science, as well as other students from all across campus. Many of these students will go on to be leaders in the next gen. I see heads nodding out there. We're starting to get into some familiar faces for the gray hairs anyway. Joe Hickey and Bob McCabe were actually my advisors. I got them out of retirement to do it, but they were among my advisors. Jim Zimmerman I took classes from. So the direct continuity between that generation and the present is very much alive. These are people who would become leaders in the next generation of Wisconsin's conservation story. Research, I know you can't read that at all. That's one of many research reports Leopold put out. Pioneering new field of research in order to recover the wildlife populations of the state. Leopold is doing the first lectures in game management anywhere in the country, training this first generation of wildlife scientists, importantly, incorporating the new science of ecology into natural resource management. This included the work at the University Arboretum, founded in 1934 as a research institution. Leopold was, in fact, appointed as chair of research. Public service outreach. Leopold was constantly out there, talking to and listening to the people of Wisconsin. Whether it's getting involved in political disputes over deer management, or taking people on outings, or again, the script there is from a WHA radio broadcast. This is a good point to make an advertisement, actually. We've been searching for 25 years to find a recording of Aldo Leopold on radio. We haven't found it yet. If anyone out there has something in your garage, let us know. And he's writing to a broad audience, not just specialists, but to now a broad general public. Articles pouring out of Leopold's office, ultimately resulting in his famous text, the Sand County Almanac, and his famous statement of a land ethic, of us belonging to the land as a community, that community to which we belong. This, of course, would go on to become a globally significant statement, and it remains one of the driving intellectual contributions in conservation. Key point is that Leopold has emerged from all this that has come before. He is emerging from and leading Wisconsin's conservation legacy, but he's not alone. He's part of a generation. And I want to allude to this too. Leopold is part of a very special generation in the agricultural college, led by the dean at the time, a fellow named Chris Christensen, who was, of course, devoted to research serving farmers and agriculture. But Dean Christensen also recommended, quote, shifting some of our efforts to social, cultural, and economic work. Leopold was a product of that, and so is this guy, John Stuart Curry, the first artist in residence on any university campus anywhere. And he was not in the art school. He was in the College of Agriculture. And of course, Curry would go on to become one of the great regionalists of the 20th century. Spent the rest of his life working here on campus, but also going around the state and working with farmers and smaller town residents all across Wisconsin, as did this fellow, Robert Gard, who took up this mission of focusing on the culture of rural life. And there's a phrase that you often see in these years. Christensen used this. He talked about our need to affect the quality of rural life, not merely work to provide research that will increase the economic profit and productivity, continue to do that, but that unless it was balanced with an attention to the quality of rural life, we would not be doing full service to ourselves. Gard would go on, he passed away in 1992, so he lives into the present as well. So we're at mid-century, before the transition to modern environmentalism. And so I'm just going to touch on a couple more figures, and then we begin to wrap it up. But Leopold had many colleagues. There were a whole generation of great contributors to this. I'll mention Norm Fassett, botanist, who helped create the State Natural Areas Program. John T. Curtis, his textbook, The Vegetation of Wisconsin, still used. 50 years later, basic text, bringing modern ecology to bear on conservation questions. And the great leap ahead to the environmental era and the transformative career of Gaylord Nelson. As governor, Nelson devoted more time and effort to the ideals of the Wisconsin idea than almost any other governor since those early figures. His broad vision of the cause that he became identified with, speaking around Earth Day, our goal is not just an environment of clean air and water and scenic beauty. The objective is an environment of decency, quality, and mutual respect for all human beings and all living creatures. This broad vision, building on, as you can see, all that came before him. But who was governor of Wisconsin on Earth Day? It wasn't Gaylord Nelson. It was Republican Warren Knowles, a graduate of the UW Law School, a rabid fisherman. Together, Nelson and Knowles have given their names to the state stewardship fund that exists to this day, despite many assaults upon it. It was named that as symbolic of the bipartisan commitment to conservation that was a core Wisconsin value. At the end of that term, around Earth Day, we go from the University of Wisconsin to the University of Wisconsin system. And I want to make this point even though I haven't mentioned it much. that we are talking not just about this campus, but all the campuses and branches of the university. And I have spoken at almost all of these, I think, over the years. I'll be at Fond du Lac next week. I work closely with the two-year college in Baraboo. So now I come to the great dilemma. Time is running short. I have a half century to go. And still before us is the large story of the continuing evolution of conservation and science into modern environmental era, i.e. how we got from Earth Day to the present, to the headlines of today. These are literally headlines of today. Bronson Koenig wanting to head out to the pipeline protest in North Dakota. Groups fighting the EPA on atrazine. Farmers holding a summit on CAFOs in Green Bay. That's a long story from here to there. This is where I get to say, come back on week 11 and stay tuned for my good friend Paul Robbins, who can cover some of this. So in short, let me cover that vast range with just a few last slides. These are people, some of you who may know some of these names, many not, I'm sure. But these are folks who carried on in the tradition. Again, sacrificing and in service to the state of Wisconsin. These are all people who are no longer with us. I didn't include anyone who's alive, because then I'd have to leave somebody out. So these are all our present folks. Let me end up with 3 quick slides to show the Wisconsin idea at work in conservation efforts just in recent decades. The Crane Foundation, the International Crane. How many have been to the International Crane Foundation? Oh my God, they're going to be so happy I asked that question. Based in Baraboo, Wisconsin, but active all around the world. I can tell you, as one who's worked with the Crane Foundation, the ties between this university campus and the work that has gone on that have made it a model for small conservation organizations with a global reach is extraordinary. The Kickapoo Valley Reserve, a long story of dispute and painful loss. We have the reserve now because of the UW extension, because of its role in facilitating public processes that have given us this reserve, and a partnership between the state of Wisconsin and the Ho-Chunk Nation. It's because of the UW extension that exists. Or here's one hot off the presses. Just last month, an agreement was signed to create the Institute for Urban Agriculture and Nutrition. Look at all these partners across the bottom. UW Extension, UW-Madison, UW-Milwaukee, the Medical College of Wisconsin, MATC. The importance of the food movement, its potential to bring people together across Wisconsin's landscape on display here. I could choose a lot of other examples. You know a lot of other examples. These are not University of Wisconsin projects, but they are all projects in which the university has played a catalytic role. So the tradition continues. Here's my last slide. It's got a little geology in it. That's one reason I chose it. I live not too far from here. It's my symbolic shot of the Wisconsin River flowing forward. So here are a few closing comments. What we mean by conservation is very different from what it meant a century ago. It remains a contested term and evolving idea. Chamberlain, Van Hise, La Follette, they wouldn't recognize the word environment even that we use. But the aim is still much the same, to promote thriving communities within healthy landscapes. We do that by nurturing resilient relationships between our culture and our land, and to do that we need knowledge, leadership, engaged citizens, and institutions dedicated to the long-term public interest. And we'll need those even more in the future as we face climate change and water issues and food issues and energy, social justice, economic issues. I know what you're saying. It's no secret to anyone that these conservation values that once made us a leader, the commitment to science, public service, inclusive, transparent public process, these things that we thought were rock solid, part of our character, have in fact been eroded. And the bipartisan commitment that built this tradition has been lost. So we find ourselves in this bind, this ideological dualism. And the question is, can we find a way out? I cannot answer that. It's an unprecedented situation. We face an uncertain future. So I'm going to end on a somewhat ambiguous note. This is from the Blue Book, a great article on the history of the Wisconsin idea that I recommend to you. Jack Stark writing, "The future of the Wisconsin idea is not necessarily assured. A major determinant of the idea's future is desire, the desire of state governments, policymakers, and university administrators and faculty members. If they resolutely decide that the idea will die, it will die. If they resolutely decide that the idea will become stronger, it will become stronger." The only thing I'd add in closing is that the future of the Wisconsin idea doesn't just reflect the desire of those in government or in the university, but of all the citizens of Wisconsin. Over the generations, the citizens of Wisconsin have made the Wisconsin idea a living reality. They showed when the Wisconsin idea was attacked last year that they care enough to retain it in the face of powerful opposing forces. So the question is, and we end on a question, do we care enough to make it work for everyone, including future generations again? Thanks.